Chimigwich, Anna, Ani, Miskwani be any Indigenous cause, Bawating and Donjaba. My name's Zack Khalil. I'm from Bawating, what's currently known as Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, based in New York. One of the contributors to New Red Order. I just want to thank Anna and Sven and Richard and everybody for setting this up and everybody for attending. Super appreciate it. I'll keep a little intro brief for this presentation. I'll say a little bit about the New Red Order and our practice of culture capture, and then I'll show 3 videos. One, which is Never Settle Calling In, which is a recruitment video for New Red Order. New Red Order is a public secret society, and we're actively recruiting new members. So if after this anyone's interested in joining, you can go to newredorder.org to sign up, or call 188-NEW-RED-1, which is our hotline. The term public secret society sometimes throws people off a little bit. New Red Order itself is an organization sort of which got its name and sort of formed in contradistinction to an actual secret society that exists today called the Improved Order of Red Men. That's a secret society that traces its lineage back to the Sons of Liberty and the Boston Tea Party, a sort of foundational American act where settler colonists dressed as Mohawk Indians to protest British taxation and throwing tea off in Boston Harbor. Improved Order of the Red Men is an actual secret society, much like the Shriners or the Freemasons, a sort of fraternal organization that's existed since the 1700s. It exists still today and is headquartered in Waco, Texas. And they only started allowing non-white members in the 1970s. But it's a society that really is fundamentally about and based upon this sort of desire for indigeneity, this desire to be Indian or to play Indian, which is something that's really deep at the heart of this country's dreams and mythologies. As Native artists operating in settler colonial spheres, we kind of think about how we're constantly asked to be informants in the typical anthropological sense. We're asked to inform on our communities and cultures in a way that can sometimes be extractive. It's often extractive, especially when you think about the history of film itself. Sort of Native people have often been at the center of the frame, and so rarely behind the camera, actually shaping our own forms of representation. So what New Red Order hopes to do in sort of trying to run with and change this other real organization, this actual secret society, Improved Order of the Red Men, is to think about how this desire for indigeneity is something so deeply entrenched in the sort of makeup of this country and our ideologies that it can't be avoided. And if it can't be avoided, we try to think about ways that it can be rechanneled to actually promote Indigenous futures, to actually benefit Indigenous people, as opposed to just be this extractive thing. Which means that we don't, when we see there a desire for indigeneity, we don't inherently want to shut it down. We want to use that as a space to explore what indigeneity means to different people, why that attraction is there, and how can that interest be made useful for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So that's just a little bit of the New Red Order. I will play a few videos now. A recruitment video, which is 4 minutes, Culture Capture Terminal Edition, abbreviated version that is 6, and Culture Capture Crimes Against Reality. 2 of those videos implement photogrammetry and 3D animation in a way that I think we'll talk about afterwards. So I'm going to share the screen, and I'll see you on the other side for a conversation. Thanks so much.
Start really living. Experience clarity. Act with confidence. Attract abundance. Be a part of the solution. Leave behind a better world. Never settle. On some level, we all want to feel this way, but sometimes in our globalized, capitalist, settler colonial society, it feels impossible. Which is why the New Red Order is developing a dynamic system to help our accomplices achieve all this and more. This free introductory video, The New Red Order, Never Settle, will tell you what you need to know to take control of your life. Hey.
It's a story of support.
It's a story of mentoring.
It's a story of collective liberation.
We are encouraging each other,
motivating each other,
so that we can be stronger together through knowledge.
The New Red Order, or NRO, is a public secret society dedicated to expanding Indigenous agency and achieving decolonization, which brings about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. But what does that have to do with me or you? Are you a settler? Am I a settler? This is making me feel bad. Does it make you feel bad? What is settler colonialism? Settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with an invasive settler society that, instead of leaving, stayed. One of the largest obstructions to indigenous growth is an excessive, some might say inappropriate, desire towards indigeneity. This desire pervades the myths, dreams, and political foundations of the so-called Americas. But how does this desire manifest? Romanticization. Appropriation. Commodification. Cultural erasure. Can these desires, despite their danger, be harnessed, converted, channeled to promote indigenous futures? You can have a place. Never settle. There are many roles for settler colonists at the New Red Order. We always need financial, material, intellectual, legal, illegal, and extra-legal support to achieve collective liberation. Join us today to create a better tomorrow today. Because we can't know where we're going unless we know where we've been. And we won't know where we've been unless we look to the past for the future. Because the future is starting to feel a lot like the present. And we all know you'd do anything to escape that.
Hey.
Thank you so much for just so generously sharing your work. Is there like a feedback in my, can you hear like a echo? Okay, that might just be my headphones. But thank you so much. Yeah, your work is amazing, and we're so lucky to get to experience so much of it. So we'll open it up to questions now. We already have 2 questions, but I just want to mention, if you'd like to ask a question, please post it in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself and feel free to ask a question yourself. So first question is from Jill. What are the major tech and software tools that you use to create these videos?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. Obviously, just Premiere video editing for the photogrammetry itself. We use iPhones and sometimes slightly better digital cameras. I have an A7 III. You don't really need a super high-res or super nice camera to make photogrammetry work. So what photogrammetry is, for anybody that doesn't know, is it's a way that you can sort of create a 3D model of an object by taking a series of photographs of that object, ideally like all around it in 360 degrees, and ideally from at least 2 or 3 different heights. Um, but from as little as like 40 or 50 photographs, you can create a 3D model of any object. And the software we use for that is Agisoft. There's a few free versions out there. That part we can all do ourselves, and it's a relatively straightforward process. And there's some interest that's a little tongue-in-cheek, but a little serious too, about making this sort of culture capture tool available to other people. You could do like a simple phone app where you input the photographs of an object that you take that you can make a 3D object out of. And then we worked with an amazing animator, Driftnote, who's an artist in his own right as well, who did the 3D animation for that last piece, Culture Capture Terminal Edition, using a variety of softwares that I'm not even can't totally wrap my brain around either, to be honest. But blend a few different ones. But the photogrammetry part itself is actually pretty straightforward and simple to do, and really anybody can do that. Yeah.
Mm. And then another question is regarding the sound. So the sound seems to be used to communicate some of the tension or blending of the organic and stimulated. Can you talk about that a bit? And John also noticed that the file was listed as 2 channels. So for the last work that we saw, were these also presented in an immersive multi-channel environment?
Awesome. Great questions. It's the last channel, the Culture Capture Crimes Against Reality, was originally a 2-channel video piece. Basically what you saw, but that's, separated out into 2 video channels. That was originally an installation work. Actually, both the culture captures were both originally created as installations. The 2-channel piece was specifically at the Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit, and really important. It was about 40 feet long by 12 feet tall, and there was a wall in the space. There was that's those specific dimensions, and so that's kind of why we wanted to create that and sort of reference that monumentality. And that kind of helps me talk about the sound as well. It's great to hear that it's kind of creating that tension. Yeah, I think, it's different, always a different experience watching something on one channel, a laptop. But originally the really large version also has like a really large subwoofer attached to it. And there's a lot in that mix that we might not necessarily be hearing now. And I think that gets to something about the way that we want to use sound a lot in our work, and in these pieces in particular, where it really is sort of visceral. It makes me think of this idea of like physiological cinema, or cinema that literally sort of affects your body and the way that you feel in a really intense sort of moment-to-moment way. I like thinking about physiological cinema in the context of thinking about what we're representing here. I'm thinking about these settler colonial monuments. It's easy to think about how sort of innocuous a monument is in some ways. I forget who said it, but there's a quote that it's to the effect of like there's nothing so invisible as a monument, sort of something that you learn not to see over time, especially, and that you ignore despite its monumentality. And so I think there's something to us about wanting to make those monuments really seen and felt in a really immediate way. And also just thinking about that although monuments might be invisible to us, they also sort of brainwash us, I think, on a day-to-day basis with their imagery. A big inspiration for us is this Canadian philosopher and theorist, Christopher Bracken, who wrote a book called Magical Criticism that I highly recommend. And we use some of his writing in these pieces, specifically sort of thinking about how discourse deploys forces, or how signs don't take the place of things, they take part in things. So a lot of what we're thinking about these pieces is the way that these monuments, as invisible or innocuous as they are, actually enact a lot of violence through their creation and their presence.
Yes,
Robert
Richard.
Measley, thank you.
Short question. kind of, it's interesting to me. What do you see in the, you kind of spoke about it just now, but the difference between capturing through this digital technology versus actual defacing or dismantling, or even virtual alteration, augmentation, maybe like the work of Christopher Ditchko is something I had to think of. So what is the act of capturing for you?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think capturing is, in some ways, it's a little tongue-in-cheek for us, thinking about the ways that Native American cultures are so intensely captured and sort of hermetically sealed inside of institutions. But I think also from a much more practical perspective, you know, defacement, vandalism, that's interesting to us too. Sort of to step back a little bit, the real impetus, or one of the impetuses for this project, was Bill de Blasio's like Commission on Monuments that happened a few years ago now, where they were looking at controversial monuments in New York. There's a lot of them, but a few that stand out are the Columbus Monument and Columbus Circle, and the equestrian statue of Theodore Roosevelt, which is in both of these videos, which is in front of the American Museum of Natural History. That commission was really interesting, and they brought in a lot of voices, what to do with these monuments. And New Red Order was like vaguely consulted in a few conversations. I think there was a big push amongst a lot of people to sort of, instead of just removing the monuments, sort of this desire to sort of create something else. I think there's a lot of people advocating for sort of creation of indigenous community space and resources to go towards that, instead of sort of being focused on these more symbolic gestures in some ways. But what ended up happening at the end of the commission is that they decided to take an additive approach, which is the way they phrased it. And to them, an additive approach was simply adding a plaque next to the controversial monument, which talks about the fact that it's controversial and why. But to get back to the Robert Musil quote, if there's nothing in this world as invisible as a monument, the only thing more invisible is the plaque next to it, generally. So that was kind of a problematic approach in our minds. And so we kind of wanted to run with that and think about, okay, what's another way that we could take an additive approach to altering or defacing these monuments? And so for us, that started with the photogrammetry, to be able to have these 3D monuments and objects to play with. And I think originally we were really thinking about manipulating, bending, and stretching them, and then like actually presenting them as possible models for how they could be amended, or how the monuments could be, how their controversial nature could be addressed in an additive way, in and of itself. So part of what we were thinking about with the capture is that once it's captured, it exists in this sort of virtual space where it really can be anything else, and where defacement can be seen as an additive thing as opposed to a subtractive thing. I think, you know, removal is something that appeals in a big way when it comes to these monuments, for sure. But there's also some problematics lying in that, in terms of thinking about the ways that how Native American people are really invisibilized in the United States in general. And one of the few ways that we're represented is these sort of racist monuments of settler colonialism. So removal in and of itself in some ways doesn't always feel like the best solution. I think an interesting example is there's a museum in Berlin, this sort of museum for statues that have sort of been deemed too controversial to exist anymore. And it's a museum where there are all these statues that have been removed or are put in one place, where people can see them and touch them and interact with them, and sort of where they're the sort of real concrete nature of them and the sort of untouchable nature of them is altered. So I think that's an interesting sort of alternative to removal in and of itself. But so for us, taking this additive approach was kind of a tongue-in-cheek approach to that monument commission. I think also, in terms of culture capture, we've also done some culture capture with Native American-made objects that are housed in museums. Something that often happens is this idea of a virtual repatriation, where a museum maybe has a culturally significant object that belongs to a tribe, but they don't want to physically give back the object in the interest of continuing to preserve it in an archive. So what they'll do is they'll create a 3D version of the object, either print it or share the file with the tribe. But that's something that always has to be done in consultation with a museum. There's a process that takes a really long time. It doesn't always happen. So in terms of culture capture, we're also thinking about culture capture as a way of spectrally repatriating objects, where you can take photos of objects that are behind the glass, that can't be touched, and that maybe a museum won't even virtually repatriate. Then you can take a series of photos of it and sort of recreate it. I think we're also interested in thinking about the sort of conflation between the virtual and the spiritual in some ways, and how these objects have real power only through the ways that they move through communities and interact with people. And so there's something, even if you don't have the physical object, in at least making the object move through people and sharing it and making it available in a different way.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Are there any other questions? I have a question, if no one does. So I was just kind of thinking about how some of your work kind of exists in this social space. You talked about organizing this public secret society that involves like kind of real situations or encounters. And you've also included like some footage from more performative projects where, you know, you go and you're documenting the photogrammetry capturing. And so I'm curious how you kind of work with these when you choose to represent something kind of in this like more social, situational space, and when you choose to work with a digital medium, and how you kind of reconcile both of those forms together, and just what your process is for considering those elements.
Thanks so much. That's a great question. I think for us, like the digital medium, and not even thinking about video, but like, you know, 3D animation where you're really creating everything. That's like a more speculative place to interact with people creatively, where you can sort of propose ideas in worlds that don't necessarily exist yet, but that you can sort of point to. And in one of the examples in Crimes Against Reality, you know, we see those three monuments sort of realized in a physical place, and that physical place is actually where you see this sort of facade of this building in the background. It's actually in the Met Engelhart Sculpture Court, where a few of these objects lie. So for us, it's interesting to sort of like also think about culture capturing an institution in some way, and sort of detouring it, or imagining it as a setting for something else, maybe the opposite of what it already does. So I think that's part of what interests us about sort of working in a purely digital space. But I think also just as like someone, as a filmmaker and someone who thinks a lot about video editing, I think there's a lot of different ways to sort of conflate the real and the unreal, the physical and the digital, especially with, form in and of itself. Thinking about the ways that these are intercut. Crimes Against Reality, for instance, there's parts of these 3D animations that are used in this much longer recruitment video that we've made. And so it's interesting to think about the ways that these sort of representations, digital representations of speculative futures, can like motivate actions and change in the present, in the way that through video editing, those sort of distinctions can be collapsed.
Thank you. Any other questions? Richard, did you have a question?
Yeah, kind of a bit following up on both things, and you also did touch on it, but I find the idea of the monument so interesting as it exists in a public space with everything that comes with that, and likely also the authority that comes with that, but also it is accessible by anyone in the physical world. So how do you see your audience and maybe the potential public space for this work? I mean, I understand it definitely has been shown in a gallery or museum context, but how do you see addressing the public with this additive reinterpretation?
That's a great question. That makes me think of sort of the origins of culture capture comes from the second video shown, Culture Capture Terminal Edition, which was actually completed during a residency at University of Syracuse. And that piece was originally a public artwork that was projected on the exterior of the I.M. Pei Design Museum there. They have a huge projection surface and a rotating sort of exhibit. So it was a piece that for us that was like addressing public art in terms of these monuments and also presented as public art. So that's one of the ways we sort of saw or through lines. I think for us too, and this idea of culture capture is a way of like, if we ever did get real about making the app that could do it, it's like a way of changing the way that people see these monuments, of making them less invisible, of sort of like having people set aside the time to sort of commit this almost ritual acts where they're encircling a public monument 2 or 3 times from different heights. And it's interesting to think about the ways that these monuments are in public and like are incredibly accessible, actually. I'm in the process of filming Terminal Edition. We're climbing all over the Columbus Monument in the middle of downtown Syracuse, a kind of sketchy neighborhood, and like there are tons of police driving by. They didn't really seem to care that much, as long as we weren't dumping a bucket of blood or red paint on it. It's been interesting too, just working on all of these works sort of pre-pandemic and pre-uprising, and it's been really exciting and energizing to see a lot of these monuments actually fall and the sort of energy behind that. And that's something that I think we want to continue to encourage and motivate and interact with as much as possible.
Thank you.
Super. Do we have time for one more question, or should we wrap?
Well, I'd like to ask a question. It's all make time. I'm really intrigued, Zach, by this notion of going after the digital artifact of the physical object. There's been, over the last couple of decades, there's been so much activity in terms of scanning objects into the digital. This just strikes me as I was watching your video, it occurred to me, what an ideal hacking target to go in and try to actually, in addition to actual physical displacement, you could go after the digital representation of so many of these things, which you're doing to some extent in the videos. But I'm thinking of museum archives. I mean, I don't know where these things are stored. They must be stored all over. But what do you think about this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think like a lot of museums, are updating their digital archives in the first place. So they already have digital records of a lot of these objects in a way. And I'm sure that those might be vulnerable to hacking in some ways. I think, I don't know, in the context of sort of like traditional Native American objects that exist in sort of ethnology museums, I think there's a way that you could consider those objects to already be sort of stolen or imprisoned in some ways. And so like the concern about digital copies of them also being sort of taken again, well, it is concerning in some ways. I think also it's sort of the least of our worries, because I think the physical reality of them being sort of imprisoned away from their communities is the bigger concern. And frankly, I don't think there's like that much desire for these objects in a lot of ways. There's a lot of interest in them, but so many of these objects that exist in museums or museum archives have just like languished in the archive for 100 years or 200 years and haven't been on display, and people aren't coming to see it because they might not know that it's there or have the resources. And I think the way that we're thinking about digitizing is sort of like a way of stealing it back, or at least taking what part of it back that we're able to without litigation. So if someone wants to hack it after then, least of our concerns, I think. But yeah, it's an interesting idea, certainly.
Yes. Okay, I suppose now we should wrap up. And I just wanted to thank you again, Zack, so much for your generosity and sharing your work and just opening up about your process. It's really inspiring to see, the breadth and depth of your various projects, and just seeing the kind of extensive iterations of each work. So we really appreciate you sharing that with us and taking questions. And I wanted to thank the organizing team for Cloud Salon, Richard, Kay, and Travis, and also Richard and Kaylin Chung for graphic design, Sam Morrison, the program coordinator, and John Sharp and Melanie Cream for support from the program. And something I think that we always end Cloud Salons with is like everyone unmutes their mics and we do a little snaps or claps, just to thank you, and just to kind of, since we're not in a space, we can share sound.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zack.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for checking it out.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming.